All right. Well, we are going to wrap up our study of Nehemiah tonight, and so if you, by being here tonight, you can say, "Hey, I was with him to the bitter end," and hopefully it won't be too bitter tonight. But a prize? Well, I should have got Lisa to make some more of the little treats for our that she did during our holiday stuff. She hasn't cooked us any goodies lately, so I don't know. Maybe you could make a little miniature wall out of cookie dough or something. We're going to get an eye roll out of that. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. So so tonight, oh, you can't. I'm like the.
Why did I say till death do us part?
I'm like the poor. You have me with you always, see? But anyway, all right. So we finished up with chapter 10. And I'm skipping chapter 11 and chapter 12, and let me explain why I'm doing that. Because it's, for the most part, just a long list of names. And not that I don't think the names are important, just we have a limited amount of teaching time, and so I'm not sure. I think our interest will be better served tonight with skipping that part. We're going to move to chapter 13 and finish up this study of the book of Nehemiah. We've already seen how he's built the wall. We've seen how the law is read. Reforms have taken place. Revival has taken place. We'll kind of see the outcome of all of that. Chapters 11 and 12 really include a casting of lots to bring people back to Jerusalem. In other words, they get the wall finished, the temple's completed, they look around and they go, there's really not enough people here to populate the city. If you were trying to rebuild Tulsa, and you were starting with 10,000 people in a city that once had 500,000, you would look around and go, okay, well, we're going to have to look around and get some people from other towns. So, they might cast lots, and some people from Claremore and some people from Pryor and some people from Owasso might all be recruited to go live in Tulsa. You might be praying that you weren't one of the ones that got recruited to do that. But that's kind of what chapters 11 and 12 are about. They cast lots to choose people to go from other cities to come back to Jerusalem to repopulate that. And then you get a list of these residents, people that were living in Jerusalem. You get a list of the priests and the Levites. And that's pretty much what 11 and 12 are. I would encourage you to read it for yourself. I'll give you some homework. But that's about all I want to say about it during our teaching time tonight. Instead, I want to pick up with chapter 13, which is kind of the summary of it all. And we'll cover 13, and we'll put some final explanation on the book of Nehemiah, make some final observations, and then we'll be on to new adventures next time, all right? So let's just take a look, verse 1 of Nehemiah chapter 13. On that day, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and it was found written that no Amorite or Moabite should ever come into the assembly of God, because they had not met the children of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So it was when they heard the law that they separated all the mixed multitude from Israel. Now before this, Eliashib the priest, having authority over the storerooms of the house of our God, was allied with Tobiah, and he had prepared for him a large room where previously they had stored the grain offerings, the frankincense, the articles, the tithes of grain, the new wine, and oil, which were commanded to be given to the Levites and singers and gatekeepers, and the offerings for the priests. But during all this I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Then after certain days I obtained leave from the king, I came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah in preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. And it grieved me bitterly. Therefore, I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. Then I commanded them to cleanse the rooms, and I brought back into them the articles of the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this. We start off with a reading of the law of Moses, and in there they find this prohibition against the Amorite and the Moabite ever entering into the assembly of God. This is a quote from Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3. That's what they're reading here when they realize this, and they go, oh, well, then we need to separate from the mixed multitude. All these people who aren't purebred Jews, we need to get them out. So what was this about? First of all, it says because, first of all, there's two reasons given. One is they didn't meet Israel on their way from Egypt with bread and water. In other words, they were hostile towards the children of Israel as they were making their way from Egypt to the Promised Land. So they became hostile. And then the second reason that's given is because they hired Balaam to curse them. Now, you remember? Anybody remember that story? What's that all about? Remember the story of the talking donkey from the Old Testament? So basically, the king of Moab hires the prophet, and boy, I use that term very loosely, but we'll go ahead and use it. The prophet Balaam to curse the children of Israel, and every time he sees them, instead of cursing, God puts a blessing in his mouth. And so, this great irony that, in an attempt to curse Israel, their enemies had actually caused a blessing to be pronounced on them. But because of this, the prohibition in Deuteronomy is never again will a Ammonite or a Moabite be allowed into the assembly of the Lord. And so it's here applied to the current situation to exclude the mixed multitude. Now we've said that the reason that they were trying to exclude the mixed multitude was the fact that they were pagans, and the fact that they were causing a stumbling block for the Jews in worshiping the one true God. They were leading the people away from the worship of the one true God. We have a bit of an interpretive dilemma or challenge. Maybe I should put interpretive situation, right? You don't have problems, we have situations. So a bit of an interpretive situation here. First of all, what is it? What do you see as the interpretive dilemma with this prohibition against a Moabite or an Ammonite ever entering the assembly of God? What? Give you the question again. I thought I was doing good to give it once. So there is an interpretive dilemma with trying to understand this prohibition against allowing a Moabite or an Ammonite into the people of God. What is it? What's the dilemma? What's the problem? So what is a prominent Moabitess from the Old Testament? Ruth. Somebody said it. Yeah, Ruth. Okay, so you've got Ruth that is a Moabitess, and she was the grandfather. She wasn't the grandfather. She was like the grandmother of who? A very prominent king, which would be who? David, who is the great ancestor of what other prominent biblical figure? Jesus. Now you see the interpretive dilemma? We've got a prohibition that says no Moabite will ever come into the assembly of God. If you take that by the letter of the law, it would appear that that would exclude not only David, the greatest king of the Old Testament for Israel, from being legitimately part of the people of God, but also Jesus Christ himself. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that obviously that's not the way it's meant to be interpreted, right? I mean, obviously we're missing something if that's where we go. So let's dig into this a little bit deeper. So how would the Jews interpret it? Well, they have a way. Their rabbis, their Old Testament Torah people have interpreted it to mean the prohibition is against and giving your daughter to marry a Moabite or an Ammonite man. In other words, the prohibition is against let me make sure I get this right, a Jewish woman marrying a Moabite or Ammonite man. It has no bearing on the woman. So they're able to say, well, you see, David was legitimate because it was Ruth. You know, Boaz was a Jew. He was an Israelite. He was an Israel. Well, he was of the tribe of Judah. I'm going to stop talking about that since I'm not completely clear about what I'm talking about. But he was from the tribe of David was from the tribe of Judah, which would mean that Boaz would have been from the tribe of Judah, right? I don't know. That doesn't sound right to me. But anyway, I'm talking in circles. They would say David was legitimate to be a part of the people of God because it was the wife who was the Moabite, not the husband. So it was good. Now you would expect the Jews to have some way of interpreting that to let their greatest king David off the hook, right? I mean, we can't have, if we're a Jew, we can't have our greatest king illegitimate, right, or not part of the kingdom. But if you look at that passage in Deuteronomy, it doesn't just exclude people from Moab or Ammon. It also excludes the eunuch. But what do we know from Acts chapter 8 about Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch? He believes and is baptized and is presumably part of the people of God. It also excludes anyone of illegitimate birth. So what do we tell someone who wants to be saved? I'm sorry, if your mother and father weren't married at the time that you were born, you have no place in the people of God. Well, obviously we don't say that. So what are we to make of this prohibition, of this command? It seems to me, as I read the story, all of these stories, but if you look at the story of Ruth denounces her Moabite lineage. What does she say to Naomi? Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you go, I will go, and where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. Your God will be my God. So it seems as though Ruth, by faith, has turned her back on the pagan people that she belonged to and embraced the people of God by faith. And What about the Ethiopian eunuch? Wasn't it by faith that he believes and becomes part of the people of God? Isn't that the message of the gospel that we proclaim today? That entrance into the people of God is by faith. It's on the basis of faith. So it's not by birth that you enter the people of God. It is by new birth, not based on your lineage, but rather on the basis of faith, which seems to make perfect sense when you look at people like Ruth. So, what do you do with this passage in Nehemiah? It seems as though the prohibition is picked up on here and applied to a group of people, this mixed multitude, that were not the people of God, because by faith they had not trusted the one true God of Israel. And so the application in Nehemiah seems perfectly legitimate to exclude them, because they're not the people of God. They are a snare to the people of God. These are not people who are going to the temple every Sabbath day and worshiping the one true God, Yahweh. These are the people who are becoming a snare to the people of God. And so that's why the exclusion here. But it's not so much bloodline as it is faith that determines who's a part of the people of God. That's how I understand it anyway. And it's really the only way in my mind I can reconcile how you could have this prohibition and yet it's broken by the bloodline of Jesus himself. So, questions on that? Maybe that's deeper than you wanted to travel in there, but anyway, now you know. Now let's talk about this guy Eliashib, who was the priest, and he does something in Nehemiah's mind that was a no-no. What did he do? Do what? Yes, he gave Tobiah a place to stay. That's right. So now, who was Tobiah? Right, Tobiah was the enemy of Nehemiah. He was the one that was sort of the constant thorn in the flesh when Nehemiah was trying to get the wall built. He was also an Ammonite, so it seems that this whole thing with the Moabite and the Ammonite is coming back into play. Nehemiah, he goes back to Persia to kind of check in with the king, and then he comes back. When he comes back, he finds things not as they were when he left. Now, that's got to be one of the most frustrating things for a leader like Nehemiah, is you put everything in order. You get everything is clicking like a well-oiled machine. You travel back to Persia to check on things there, and then you come back and everything is in disarray. Very much like Moses, who leaves the children of Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, says, okay, I'll be back. I've got to go talk to God. He goes up 40 days. He gets the 10 Commandments. He comes down, and they've made a golden calf, and basically just what was this wonderful people of God now is this rebellious rabble that has gone away from the Lord. And so it very much seems to be the same kind of deal when Nehemiah gets back. And one of the things he sees is this Tobiah, who was so much problem before. He sort of weaseled his way in. Now, if you remember from earlier chapters, Tobiah had connections. He was sort of kin to some folks. And it seems as though that's part of what's going on here, is that he's pulling some strings. He's calling in some favors here. And he's like, hey, I need a place to stay. And so Eliashib, the priest, allows him to stay in the temple and cleans out some of the rooms that were used for some of the grain offerings and lets him stay in there. Sets him up a little quarters. Well, there's a couple of things wrong with this. First of all, that's not what that area in the temple was for. It wasn't a guest room. It had a specific purpose, and it wasn't for accommodations. But beyond that, he was an Ammonite. So he wasn't even supposed to be in the temple. Gentiles weren't allowed. There was a certain area in the temple that they could be and nowhere else. But certainly they weren't just given free reign of, storerooms and things to go in. So on a couple of different levels, this was wrong. And then, it had this kind of stick in his craw that here this guy that had caused me so much trouble, as soon as I'm gone, now he's living in the temple. So there's a little bit of that going on. A little bit of, I kind of think, to some extent there was a little bit of personal animosity going on there as well. And so, verse 8, it grieved me bitterly, and I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. He kicked him out. It kind of reminds me of when Jesus cleanses the temple. He comes in and he finds the money changers there, and he goes and drives them out. It seems to be kind of the same thing that Nehemiah is attempting to do here. So when he comes back, he finds things are not as he had left them, which is disappointing. Any questions or comments on those verses? What did he do with it when he emptied it out? Well, we're fixing to see that a lot of the tithe that was supposed to be coming in wasn't coming in. So that, and Tobiah very well may have had his fingers in the till as well. Let's look on to verse 10, and we'll see that all these great amounts of tithes that were supposed to be coming in were actually coming in at all. Verse 10, I also realized that the portions for the Levites had not been given them, for each of the Levites and the singers who did the work had gone back to his field. So I contended with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? I gathered them together and set them in their place. And all Judah brought the tithe of the grain and the new wine and the oil to the storehouse. I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses Shelemiah the priest and Zadok the scribe and of the Levites, Pedaiah, and next to them was Hanan the son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah, for they were considered faithful, and their task was to distribute to their brethren. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for its services. In those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem and on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre dwelt there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said to them, what evil thing is this that you do by which you profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do this? And did not our God bring all this disaster on us and this city? Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. So it was at the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, that I commanded the gates to be shut and charged that they must not be opened until after the Sabbath. And I posted some of my servants at the gates so that no burdens would be brought in on the Sabbath day. Now merchants and sellers of all kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice, and I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they came no more on the Sabbath. Nehemiah, he's getting kind of contentious here. I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. And remember me, O God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy. Okay, so what did Nehemiah find when he returned to Jerusalem? he found that the tithes had not been given to the Levites. In fact, they weren't getting their provisions, and so they actually had to go back to the fields. They had to go back to their own homes and work for a living there. You say, well, what's wrong with that? That's, it don't hurt them to work. Okay, why was that a bad thing? Yeah, sure, there's nobody there to take care of the temple and the service. So, what it meant was that because the people weren't bringing in the tithes, they couldn't afford to pay the people that worked at the temple, so they had to go back home to make a living there, which meant no one was doing the work of the temple. So what it meant basically was nobody was doing the Lord's work. So it was a bad thing. Beyond that, they also found that people were breaking the Sabbath day. I think this is what Nehemiah takes such exception to. He's like, that's what caused us to have to go into exile to start with. That's what caused this mess to start with. And apparently they've learned nothing. They've not learned their lesson at all. They're still working on the Sabbath. He finds men of Tyre coming and selling on the Sabbath. So he basically, he comes in and he takes steps to try to resolve these issues. He cleanses the rooms that the offerings are to go in. He cleanses the rooms that Tobiah was in. He brings back the articles of the temple. He appoints treasurers to oversee the offerings. In other words, want to make sure not only they're coming in, but that they're getting spent the way they're supposed to, that they're getting distributed to the Levites like they're supposed to, that there's no funny business going on with the offerings. And he commands the gates to be shut on the Sabbath day. We're going to shut and lock the gates of the Sabbath day. We're not letting any merchants from any foreign lands come in and sell anything. And a time or two, he said, I caught them sleeping outside the gate, just waiting, looking for a chance to come in and sell. And he's like, I went to him and I said, why are you doing this? If you don't leave, I'm going to, what does he say here? I'm going to contend with you or something. Is that what he says? I'm going to lay hands on you. In other words, I'm going to take matters into my own hands, and it will not be pleasant to you. Nehemiah's got a little grit in his craw. You got to like Nehemiah. I mean, he's a nice guy. He's a godly man. But when he gets his dander up, I mean, you can get him riled up. It seems. We're going to see here in a little bit where he says that he curses them and strikes some and pulls out their hair. So he gets wound up here in a little bit. We're gonna see. But he takes matters into his hands to resolve these issues. But I want us to see kind of what this is a very telling thing. Nehemiah comes in. He leads the building project of the wall. It's completed. They read the law. People are broken at the hearing of God's law. All this great revival takes place. All these reforms take place. As things are really going good and the people are serving the Lord, Nehemiah travels back to Persia. When he returns, he finds everything pretty much back the way it was before that. They have a really nice wall, but the people are back to not serving the Lord again. What does this tell us about what actually took place in Jerusalem? Yeah, it seems to be emotion more than real commitment. Yeah. Very little repentance. Like she said, caught up in the moment without really any lasting commitments. When Nehemiah is not looking, they go back to their own ways. And it seems to be, if you look at it in those terms, it seems to be more of a Nehemiah revival than an Israel revival. I look at the person of Nehemiah, and he goes from, the cupbearer to the king in Persia to this great leader, this great man of God, one that we now look to as an example. You want to see a man of God, look at Nehemiah. Here's what you aspire to. I mean, he definitely had a changed life. It was a revival for Nehemiah. But if you look at a revival for the nation as a whole, not so much. They obeyed as long as somebody was watching them. And when Nehemiah wasn't there, they went back to their old ways. Very much childlike. Very much like a kid that obeys as long as mom and dad are watching me, but when mom and dad have their back turned, I'm going to do what I want to. So that seems to be what you have here with the people of Israel in Nehemiah's day that do what? It seemed to be, certainly, not to say that there was no one in Israel serving God except Nehemiah, but it certainly seems to be the people in general. It wasn't there. The commitment wasn't there. Good intentions, and what did that lead them to? Rebellion against God. Right? What? Well, it is. I mean, if you look at, as I said, Israel at the foot of Mount Sinai, everything's good as long as Moses is there. He's gone for 40 days on the mountain. He comes back, and all of this debauchery is taking place. They've made a golden calf. They're worshiping him, this golden calf. He asked Aaron, "What have you done?" "I don't know. They all gave me their gold, and I threw it in the fire, and out popped this calf," as if to say, not my fault. We have to be careful that revival, real revival, isn't some emotional response or something that we do if the preacher's watching. It's real revival is measured by what we do when no one's watching. You can't measure your commitment to God based on what you do when people are watching. You have to measure it based on what you do when nobody's watching. It is personal. And it was personal for Nehemiah, but I'm not sure it was personal to a lot of the other people in Israel, it seems. Questions or comments on those verses? All right, then let's look on. We'll finish this up. I'm in 23. In those days, I also saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod and could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke according to the language of one or the other people. So I contended with them. This is great. This is classic. So I contended with them. I cursed them, struck some of them, and pulled out their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, "You shall not give your daughters as wives to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or yourself." Somebody ought to make a movie about that. That would be interesting to see. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Should we then hear of your doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women? One of the sons of Joadah, the son of Eliashib the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I drove him from me. Sanballat, if you remember, was another one that was causing him great trouble. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I cleansed them out of everything pagan. I cleansed them of everything pagan. I also assigned duties to the priests and the Levites, each to his service, and to bringing the wood offering and the first fruits at appointed times. Remember me, O my God, for good. And so the book closes there. So he addresses this issue of mixed marriages that the people had married the people of the land. The Jews had married the people of the land. Some of their kids didn't even speak the language. They spoke the language of the pagans. So he said, I contended with them. I pulled out their hair. I cursed them. I made them swear they wouldn't give their daughters to their sons, or their sons to the pagans' daughters as their husbands. What was his issue with this? What? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble. They were diluting everything. By that you mean diluting the people of God, the faith. As we've said before, it wasn't a prohibition against interracial marriage. It was a prohibition against interfaith marriage. In other words, the problem was that these people didn't worship the one true God, and they became a snare. In fact, the Israelites were told to, when they came into the Promised Land, they were to destroy completely all of the foreign people in that land. They chose not to do that. They left some of them, trying to be kind and, trying to do what they thought was best rather than what God told them. Do we ever do that? I did what I thought was right, even though it wasn't what God told me to do. And what came as a result of that? Well, they became a snare to the people of Israel, led them into idolatry. That's what led to this whole exile in the first place. Now they're back. Nehemiah comes back, and they're doing the same things again. They're breaking the Sabbath. They're marrying the pagans. They're doing all the things that they did to start with that led them into the problem that they had in rebellion against God. So he says, I contended with them. They pulled out their hair because he saw this as a stumbling block. A person of God, one who is a part of the people of God, should not bind themselves in marriage to one who is not of the people of God. And that is a command that's still in effect for the New Testament today. We're not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Why? Because they will be a snare to you. If you go out and marry someone who is not a believer, and I've heard it all before, everything from I love him, my love will change him. No, it won't. I've been doing marriage counseling a long time. If the Lord if their love for the Lord ain't going to change them, then their love for you sure ain't going to change them. But what will happen most of the time is they will bring you down. They will drag you down. That's what happened to Israel here. And Nehemiah here, Nehemiah in verse 26, he uses Solomon as an example. And I thought this was interesting because if you've been with us on Sunday nights, we've been doing a sermon series through the life of Solomon, and we're just getting to the part that's going to be referenced here about his taking all these foreign wives. I don't know what all Solomon took after David, his dad, but his love for pretty women seemed to be one of them, and he had a lot of foreign wives, the Bible says, and they turned his heart against God. And so the example is used here to say, look, Solomon was a man of God. He loved the Lord, and the Lord loved him, and yet he stumbled over these foreign wives. So if a great man of God like Solomon, who was wise, and God loved him, and he loved God, if he could be brought down this way, surely we ought to be humble enough to know we can be as well. And so that's the illustration there. And finally, he closes the book with this prayer. What is it? Remember me, O God. In other words, so he prays Sometimes he says, remember them, talking about his enemies. In other words, don't let evil win the day. Sometimes he says, remember me for good. In other words, I've tried to do the right thing. Take that into consideration, God. But then ultimately, it seems a prayer for grace. Remember me in your grace. In other words, God, I've done the best I can. I've tried to be a man of God. I've tried to walk by faith. Remember me. And it seems to be a prayer of faith. Not so much remember me based on my works and judge me on that, but remember me. I love you, and I've tried to be your man. Remember me kind of deal. And that's how the book ends. I'll give you a couple little application questions here that we can ponder. What truths can Christians today glean from the command to separate from pagan nations? What do you think? We are, go ahead. Yeah, we are called to be separate from the world. We are not called, we're called to be salt and light to the world. Very difficult to be salt and light to the world if you look just like it. So we're called to be separate from the world. And I think also, as we look at it, and we look at people like Ruth, and we look at the people of the person of the Ethiopian eunuch, and people like this, that each person is accepted or rejected as part of the people of God on the basis of faith. And I think that's what's important to remember. I think that is the message of the gospel, that no one, particularly this side of the cross, no one is born as the people of God. You must be reborn as the people of God. And that comes on the basis of faith. And then the other little question here is, how might we sum up the genuineness of revival? What do you think? What? Results, yeah. What do you do when no one is watching? That's how you know whether revival is genuine or not. I wrote this down as I was doing all this and preparing all this. This is original to me, but I wrote this down. The evangelist records how many decisions were made, but God records how many commitments are kept. So I think that's something. You can't ultimately judge the success of a revival based on the number of decisions that are made. You judge it based on the number of commitments that are kept. All right, and so that wraps up Nehemiah. Any questions or comments on Nehemiah? All right, well, I've enjoyed studying Nehemiah with you. So being here tonight, you get the bonus of knowing where we're going to be next time. So, next week we will start a study of the book of Acts. I am intending it to sort of be the sequel study to our Life of Christ study. If you were a part of that study, that Life of Christ study that we wrapped up, I don't know, how long ago was that? 6 months ago or something? I don't know. Time gets away from me. But we'll do it very much the same way. We'll do a study like this. We'll have little video clips, maybe from Dave Stott's drive-through history stuff like we did. Maybe I'll have some pictures to me. There is a group of church members that are going on a Footsteps of Paul trip. Maybe there'll be some pictures come back from that. We'll see. But anyway, so we'll have an opportunity to travel the roads that Paul and Silas and Timothy traveled, and the places we'll go, right? All the adventures we'll share. You just can't wait. I know it's going to be great. It's going to be grand. If you like if you like travel, Acts is your book. If you like adventure, Acts is your book. If you like missions, hey, Acts is where it all begins. So if you like church history, it all starts in Acts. So it's a wonderful book. I'm planning right now on 40 weeks. So you take out for vacations and holidays, I'm figuring about a year. So, maybe by like the 4th of July of 23, we'll be completed with our study. But anyway, I'm looking forward to it, and I hope that you will enjoy it as well, and I hope you'll commit to be a part of that. And if anybody says, what are we going to study next? You just say, well, you should have been there. No, I don't care. You can tell them. Yes, you can tell them. I don't care. All right. Let's close in a word of prayer. And there's Trey. Hi, Trey. All right, let's close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for your chance to study, this chance to study your word, Lord. I thank you for the time that we've had in the book of Nehemiah, for what you have taught us, Lord. Help us, God, to apply it to our lives. And Lord, I pray that we would serve you even when no one is watching. Lord, that our life might be judged rightly by the commitments that we keep to you. God, I pray that you would bless us, Lord, prepare our hearts for Sunday as we'll be back to worship you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.